Welcome to Patricia's Potpourri. And as you know, you can always get past episodes on YouTube. But today I have a very special program for you, a very special guest, a historian extraordinaire, Mr. Khalif Williams. Good, welcome, Mr.
Thank you so
Khalif,
much
my
for having me. I
brother.
appreciate it.
Yes, Khalif Williams, could you please tell me a little about yourself?
Sure. I'm an independent African historian. I'm a researcher and an essayist. I write mostly on African religion, African history and culture, and also the connections between African culture and hip hop culture.
Wow. I also know that you have written an essay about Dr. Ben. And for those who do not know who Dr. Ben is, and Dr. Ben is very dear to my heart, could you please tell our audience a little about Dr. Ben?
Sure. The essay that I wrote is not about him, it's dedicated to him because he inspired the writing itself. Who Dr. Ben is? Dr. Ben is, wow, he's so many things. He is an Egyptologist, African Egyptologist, anthropologist. He was a lawyer, he was a civil engineer. He was born in Gondar, Ethiopia, 1918, December 31st. To an Ethiopian father from Gondar. His mother was Puerto Rican Yemenite Jew, and he was born in Gondar himself. He moved to the Caribbean, I believe it was around the age of 6 years old, and he grew up in the Caribbean between Puerto Rico, St. Croix, and St. Thomas.
I recently went to Dr. Ben's funeral, or I went to Dr. Ben's funeral, and there was a Puerto Rican contingency.
Yes.
At Dr. Ben's funeral, and they acknowledged their Nubian heritage.
Yes. Dr. Ben, in Puerto Rico, he did major work. Matter of fact, the first book that he wrote was We the Black Jews, Witness to the White Jewish Race Myth. That was actually written in Spanish in Puerto Rico, I believe it was in 1936. Then when he came to the United States, I believe it was published in English. I believe it was in 1939. From what I know, from what he said about himself, he also protested with the Black Shirts in Puerto Rico, which was a revolutionary group fighting against U.S. hegemony in the Caribbean and specifically Puerto Rico, the island of Vieques. So he has deep roots in Puerto Rico as a revolutionary and also as a historian trying to correct the telling of African history.
Dr. Ben, as a writer, I know he wrote 48 or 49 books.
Yes, prolific writer. And actually, from what I understand, he has quite a few unpublished works as well.
Dr. Ben is dear to my heart because when I was a stipend youth, I worked for the anti-poverty program.
Yes.
And Dr. Ben, Carl Campbell, Dr. Clark, and they would come to the old Schaumburg Library.
Yes.
And teach us civilization, Black heritage. And it was important that they teach us these things at that age because it reinforced all the positivity for us at a young age. And that was, and Dr. Clark.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I said Dr. Clark.
Yes, you did.
Yes.
And the most important thing, Dr. Ben, one of the most important things, there were so many things he did, was not to be afraid to tell your story. He did the field work. He went to Nubia. He went to Egypt. He turned the spade over in the soil, and we got firsthand accounts of what he discovered. And a lot of what he discovered refuted what European Egyptologists were putting out about who the Egyptians were, and he was never afraid to tell the truth. Him and Dr. Clark, for that matter, I remember Leonard Jeffrey spoke about it before, that they both could have been rich. You know, if they would have done what the establishment wanted them to do, they could have, you know, sat on Easy Street, made a lot of money, but they would have never had the opportunity to tell the truth. And they chose to tell the truth, and as a result, sadly they ended up dying relatively broke. But ultimately they got...
May I refute what you just said? I think that they ended up dying very rich because they were not bought and sold. And
I could agree with that.
how many people in history, uh, there's not they could not they do not have a price on them.
Absolutely, I agree with
know?
that. They're rich in the African term, and when I say that, I mean for African people, children are considered your riches because they are your genetic descendants. So as long as you have living relatives in the world, that means that you never essentially die. Your genes are still in the world. For Dr. Ben, and I could throw Dr. Clark, John Jackson, Chancellor Williams, all of the greats that told our story, they have spiritual genetic offspring. I'm one of them. All of the generations of people, Dr. Ben took thousands of people to the Nile Valley in order to show them firsthand what their history is and the fact that our ancestors put it in stone so that it could be there for posterity. If you go to Egypt, you can see the levels of destruction, from chiseling the faces off of the statues to completely removing entire sections of temples with information about our people to lightening up the images. I remember there were images that I took in Egypt that turned out to be lightened up years later. So they started off as darker images, and now, 10 years later, 8 years later, they're different. A brother named Manu Ampim has a website dedicated to the destruction of Nile Valley artifacts, and his work is extensive in showing, and he takes pictures dating back from maybe the 80s and the 70s, and he shows you the same exact place, same temple, and the images are completely different or gone. So this destruction is constant, it's always happening. Matter of fact, the disrespect for our artifacts, I remember when we went to Egypt in 2007, there was an Arab Egyptian that was hiding out in a section of the temple that was not really frequented by anyone. And he said that he had a mummy in a canvas bag in pieces, that if you paid him money, he would reassemble it so you can see it. He wouldn't allow you to take pictures. So, and this was a black mummy, obviously, African features, but it was hidden, and he was trying to make money on the side at the temple structure. As far as if you pay him under the table, he'll let you see these particular artifacts. And this is something that happens a lot. The only reason that any of our structures still exist, especially under Arab control, is because they've made so many millions of dollars off of it. If there was no money to be made, they would have destroyed them a long time ago.
I went to Egypt also, and I had a fabulous time. Mm-hmm. And I didn't go with Dr. Ben, but I went to with another group as a tag along, my daughter and I. And no matter what household we went to, people asked me 2 questions. Mm-hmm. And everyone was very cordial. They identified with us. Yes. And they asked me, do you know Malcolm X? Did you know, or do you know Malcolm X, or did you know? Yes. And they asked you, did I know, or do you know Dr. Ben? Yes. And but we had so many wonderful times with hibiscus tea. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. And they told me Dr. Ben's stories when he would come there. So it was very, very good, and it was beautiful in Egypt. When I went, and I almost have tears in my eyes right now because the experience was so powerful, and the love that I felt and experienced was wonderful from the native people there.
And I had a similar experience with people asking me about Dr. Ben as well. We didn't get the first rumblings of Dr. Ben until we got to Abydos. That was the first time there was a small-framed African man wrapped up in a turban, all white, and he came to us while we were with the scholar we were traveling with, and he asked us, how's Dr. Ben? How's Dr. Ben? And those of us who knew him, not everyone on the trip knew who he was. We were able to, give them an update on how he was doing. Then when we got further down to Nubia, to Aswan, and to Luxor, because one thing that I loved about Dr. Ben was he originally started taking people from Cairo down the Nile. And what he did was reverse it, because since the origin of the Egyptians was from the south, Ethiopia and Nubia, he started his trips from the south to the north. So you can see the progression of African culture from its earliest stages down to its highest expression in Egypt rather than the other way around. And he also made it a point to stop by indigenous Nubian villages so that you could have direct contact with the people. The scholar, Runoko Rashidi, who we went on the trip with, he did the same thing. We actually donated books to the local school there. These were all things Dr. Ben felt was essential to establish connections between us and our African brothers and sisters, and also to help them. You know, these trips were not just fact-finding missions for African Americans and African Caribbean people. It was also about establishing a love for Africa and for all things African. And part of that was the connection with the people. Like I said when we were talking before, when I went there, the Nubians called us Nubian Americans. They didn't call us African Americans, and they called us their brothers. A lot of times I've heard African Americans say, well, you know, African people don't like us, they sold us off into slavery, whatever excuse you want to give for an African American disconnecting themselves from anyone who comes here from the continent. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, there are ignorant people out there that look like us who don't know their story, but the vast majority, and I didn't experience any negativity in Egypt at all. Every person that was black came to me with love and respect, and I gave it back in return.
I felt the same way. And I met people who had such knowledge. Mm-hmm. Now, you and I spoke about the negative confessions.
Yes.
And we saw that.
Yes.
You in your 2007 in Egypt, and me in my year 2000
yes.
in Egypt, the negative confessions. Could you tell my audience, what do they call it? They might have seen Gil Noble's Like It Is
yes.
back in the day, mm-hmm. and they can always go and find that
yes.
information.
On YouTube,
but could you tell our audience about the negative confessions and how it was repackaged?
Sure. The negative confessions were laws that were codified and written in certain Egyptian temples that basically were admonishments on the behavior of man, how to interact with one another, and in order to have a balanced and just society. Dr. Ben spoke about the fact that there were 147 negative confessions, which were eventually shortened to 42, and Moses himself shortened them to 10. Now, and that's how we got the 10 Commandments in Christianity. The main thing about it was that, being that in the Bible it states that Moses was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians, that means, first of all, he was an initiate, and they called him a hierophant, which means he was a high priest. And there's no way, as a priest, because as we talked about earlier, in Egyptian cultural spiritual system, the child would go into the lodge for schooling at age 7 and would not graduate until 47. So it took 40 years for them to actually graduate with all of the knowledge and wisdom that they would need to function in society the way that society was made then. And Moses, being a high priest, would have been thoroughly familiar with those laws. Also, it's weirdly enough, also when Moses killed Pharaoh's soldier and went on the run, and Aaron stole from Pharaoh and also went on the run, this was pre-10 Commandments. So obviously he knew about these laws before he supposedly brought them to the Jews, because he had murdered Pharaoh's soldier and was on the run because he knew murder was wrong. So murder had to have been wrong long before he got the 10 Commandments down off the mountain, and he was fully aware of that. So anyone who knows the chronology of his history would know that there's no way that he could have invented or got them from some mythical god on a mountain, when that for thousands of years those laws were established in Egyptian culture. So that's the biggest, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions, is that he invented this, when ultimately, like I said, his brother was a thief, went running from Pharaoh, so he knew thievery was wrong. One of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill, is another one. Moses obviously knew that because he had killed Pharaoh's soldier before he got the 10 Commandments and went on the run. So if he didn't know this, if God did not bestow this knowledge of moral character, he should not have run. He should have sat there and said, I didn't know any better. I killed him, you know?
When were you first introduced to Dr. Ben?
Wow, okay. This is going to tell him my age. Okay, the first
No,
time.
no, we don't do age on this.
Well, I'm not going to give my age, but ultimately, I met him or saw him for the first time at about 5 or 6 years old. So we're talking about 1978, 1979. My father migrated here from the Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago in 1971, him and my mom. When he got here, I remember he told me he went to school and he was told by a college professor that African people had no history of note. We didn't contribute anything to human civilization. This is in New York City. Go ahead.
I want to say Arturo Alfonso Schomburg
Yes.
was told the same thing by one of his teachers in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
And that's what led him to do that research and getting all the black history that he could find and compile it. And that's a put down, you know, that's a real put down.
Well, I'd say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That tactic has been used intergenerationally, so his experience is not foreign. My father's experience wasn't foreign. He actually heard the same thing in Trinidad before he came here. And he told me that he always knew in his heart that wasn't true. He just didn't have the direct connection with his history to verbalize that truth. And he met Stokely Carmichael, who we know as Kwame Ture. That was the first revolutionary he met in New York City after Kwame Ture gave a speech at his college. And through them meeting, that's how he was introduced to Dr. Ben. By the time I was about 5 or 6, he started bringing me to First World Alliance, where they would have meetings at the Schomburg Center, Reverend Daughtry's church, a lot of different locations around the city, mostly in Manhattan, some in Brooklyn. And we would get together in small groups, sometimes larger groups as time progressed. And basically he would teach us about our history, teach us the origins of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ancient Egyptian religion, and basically correct our story. Like I said, my dad introduced me to him at about 1978, 79, and the impact he had on me was very profound.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. How did the impact affect your life?
It changed everything because as a child, my parents separated, so I grew up with my mom, and she made us go to church regularly. Every Sunday we went to church, and she did the best she could. You know, that's all she knew. She came from Trinidad as a Christian, and she tried to raise me as a Christian, but it was never something I fully embraced. I always felt uncomfortable with Christianity. It was very scary to me. The concept of a God that was angry and wanted to destroy you for every little thing just was something that did not resonate with me. So I wasn't always the most cooperative on a Sunday morning. And when I started to hear Dr. Ben discuss the origins of Christianity in Africa, it transformed my consciousness because the type of Christianity he was speaking of was diametrically opposed to what we learned in the church. Everything was a very Europeanized, white supremacist version of Christianity, whereas Dr. Ben was talking about the authentic earth religion that Christianity really was. And it's funny, one of the most ardent racists, Wallace Budge, who probably stole more artifacts from Egypt than anyone else, more papyrus scrolls than anyone else in history, in his book Osiris, parts 1 and 2, he discusses emphatically that the first Christians in the world were Nubian people. They did not call their religion or their way of life Christianity, but all of the symbols of Christianity was there, the story of Christianity, the Immaculate Conception, the death and resurrection of a deity, and then also the moral character. If you ever study Homer, if you study Herodotus, even the early Arabs who came to Africa, they always spoke about the moral sanctity of African society. They were actually in the histories by Herodotus. He talks about Ethiopians being the most moral, the most just, the most upright people, and that was because when they came there were no jails. There was no such thing as an orphanage because no one discarded their children. There was no such thing as an old folks home because no one discarded their elderly. Everyone took care of each other. And the moral fabric of the society being what it is, there was no need for a prison. All of that came with the invasion of the continent by Europeans and Arabs. And he made that emphatically clear with the teachings that he taught, as far as the information he brought forth both from the field and from his research.
In your essay, and you have a beautiful essay.
Thank you.
No, really, well written. What is your concept of heaven? And it has to be, your concept of heaven has to be something that we all can appreciate.
No problem. In the essay, I actually said that heaven is between the legs of an African woman. That statement was a statement that I heard Dr. Ben make many years ago. This is back in the 80s, but he got it from someone long before him. That would be Pharaoh Pepi II. He's one of Egypt's earliest pharaohs, and he was the one who made that statement. And when he said it, I was kind of thrown off because we're taught that heaven's in the sky, and when you pray to look up to, I guess, the sky, the stars, to talk to God. And Dr. Ben was the first person who simplified. He made everything plain. According to Malcolm X, he made it plain. And what it is that ultimately heaven, being between the legs of an African woman, I state that because when a male and female consort with one another, the putting on the cloth of physical flesh is a mystery that takes place in the womb of a mother. So in other words, you go from a single cell organism, an ovum and a sperm, come together to become one. Those cells multiply in a way that we don't understand in an organized fashion to go from those 2 cells into a full-blown human being after 9 months of gestation. That takes place in the womb of a mother. And as a result, when a child is in the womb, they feel they're not cold, they're not hungry because they get sustenance directly from their mother's blood. So you are in heaven, essentially. A child is in bliss. It's only once a child is born and you come out and you're born in the hospital, you are physically separated from your mother. They cut the umbilical cord, which is how you were getting your sustenance, which was why you were never hungry. They take you out of the warmth of her womb into the cold, wet environment that we call the world, and you feel cold for the first time. And for the first time, you feel separation from your mother. So in other words, the first feelings of hunger take place when they disconnect you from your mother by way of the umbilical cord. So heaven ends at birth. And as men, we try to get back to heaven as often as possible. So there we go. It's a metaphorical, not going too far, but ultimately that is why I state that. There's a mystery that takes place in a woman's womb that cannot be explained, and it only happens there. Men do not make children. I remember Dr. Ben said in one lecture, everyone in here has an umbilical cord, is that correct? Everyone said yes. He said, well, there's no way you can tell me, essentially, that Eve came from Adam, because even Adam had an umbilical cord, so that means he had a mother as well. But we're not taught to see things plain. We're taught that everything is mysterious, and that the Bible is this big mystery that we have to decipher, and God is this mysterious character out in the sky that's going to come down and save us, when in reality it's our daily existence. God is with us everywhere we are. And most importantly, the first deity of any person is their mother. You learn everything from your mother: how to speak, how to clean yourself properly, how to be a human being, how to interact with others, how to interact with the opposite sex or the same sex. All of these things start with her. She's the first teacher. So she's God. If she doesn't show you anything, you die. No different than wild animals. If the mother doesn't raise that offspring to a certain point where it can survive for itself, it's a lost offspring.
When you talk about deities,
Yes.
there's a deity, Min, Min.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about deity Min? Absolutely.
Min is a very, very old god. And if you look at his name, he has part of the name Amen in it, or Amin. It's just M-I-N is how you spell the name. What makes him very important is, he is what you call an ithyphallic deity. So he's always shown with an erect phallus in all of his artwork. And the brilliance is that in Nile Valley high culture, they always referred to the woman as the primary deity. So it's not that we necessarily said that women were more important than men. We put them first because they were primary. They came before us. And that's the respect that's shown to the mother. One of the reasons the respect is shown to the mother. The other one is because Pharaoh cannot sit on the throne in Egyptian or Nile Valley high culture except through the line of his mother. If you look at the deity Set, which is the wife of Osiris, her main symbol is a throne seat. And the throne seat is a throne that Osiris actually sits on. And that's considered the lap of his mother. The throne is considered your mother's lap. That when you're born, you sit on your mother's lap, just like they show the Madonna and Child in Christianity with Jesus sitting on Mary's lap in a cradled position. That is what the throne seat is considered for the Pharaoh. He's considered the divine king. The throne seat would be the symbol of his mother.
When you talked about Jesus and Mary, could you tell me a little bit about your writing and the Immaculate Conception?
Sure. I'm going to get into that. Let me just finish with the Deity Min because I didn't finish that.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. With the most important aspect of the Deity Min is not the fact that he's shown with an erect phallus. It's where they place it. In some of his images, it's shown in the anatomically correct position. In other images, it's shown in the region of his navel, which is a symbolic depiction of the fact that even God the Father has a mother. So that his phallus being in the region of his navel speaks to the intimate connection between him as a child of his mother, the deity.
Well, you know, I know I have to invite you back again.
Oh, thank you. I would love to be back.
This has been so wonderful, and I was a student of Dr. Ben myself. Yes. So maybe before you, but nevertheless, no I would like for you to come back.
Thank you so much.
Could you please say your name for the camera?
Yes, Khalif Williams.
And historian extraordinaire.
Oh, thank you.
And a student of Dr. Ben.
Thank you so much.
Thank
As
you.
are you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And your knowledge is so extensive.
Thank you.
You know, I would love to, what happened with me.
Yes.
Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and
yes.
Dr. Campbell and people come to the basement of the Schomburg to teach us about Black history and Black culture, because after I knew who I was.
Yes.
But after I learned more, I maybe that's why I feel untouchable.
It changes everything. It gives you a benchmark to strive for. A lot of our children tend to state that they don't understand science or they don't understand mathematics, and they tend to stray away from those subjects. And like Dr. Ben used to say, how could you when we invented these things? This is in your gene pool. This is who you are. So there's no way that you can't understand it. You just need to be taught.
We need those type of programs.
Absolutely.
Yes, we do. Okay, I remember Booker Coleman.
Yes.
With the pyramid, but we'll get to him another time.
Okay.
Once again, I know that our time is counting down.
Yes.
And once again, I got to thank you, Mr. Khalif Williams.
Thank you so much.
Okay, how may we get in touch with you?
Yes, I have my email address is raskhalif@comcast.net, and my website is www.nondomesticatedthinker.com. It is now under construction, but it should be up within, I think, probably a couple of months. I'm just rebuilding everything right now.
Are you available to come out and speak to groups?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, remember you can get this episode and other episodes at Patricia's Potpourri on YouTube. Thank you very much for being a good audience. Please try to contact Mr. Williams.
Thanks again.